The Italian mafia had seen everything. For 50 years, the men who ran Detroit's underworld thought there was nothing left in this world that could surprise them. They had buried rivals in concrete. They had made a national figure vanish off the face of the earth and never answered for it. They had watched men beg, watched men break, watched men do unspeakable things for money and power. They were the oldest, coldest hands in the city. And then they met the men in this story, and for the first time in their lives, the Italians could not believe their eyes, because the men they had just taken under their wing were black gangsters out of the Detroit streets, men the mafia had been raised to look down on, men they assumed they would use and discard like everyone else. And instead, what they found was a crew that operated at a level the Italians had never seen in 50 years in this business. The preparation, the discipline, the sheer cold professionalism of how these black men moved, planned, and handled their work. It did not just impress the Italians, it scared them. Not the soldiers, not the captains, not even the bosses themselves, because the crew turned out to be something none of them had a category for. The violence was beyond anything the family had on its own roster. The discipline was colder, and one of them was so precise, so meticulous, so frighteningly intelligent that he treated killing the way a surgeon treats an operation. A genius, a perfectionist. A man who made the Italians' own legendary killers look like amateurs swinging in the dark. Some of these men were so feared that the mafia would not deal with them face to face. They communicated through third parties. Messages passed through middlemen because the bosses did not want to be in the same room. Sit with that. The most powerful Italian crime family in Michigan, the men who made Jimmy Hoffa disappear, kept their distance from their own hired help because what those men were capable of was simply too much to be near. They called the crew Murder Row, and this is the story of some of the most dangerous black gangsters who ever walked the planet. The men the Italian mafia built, armed, and unleashed on Detroit, and what the Italians themselves witnessed when they did. This is that story. Let me tell you how the Italians ended up in business with men they were raised to look down on, because that is where this starts. Not with the violence, with a relationship that was never supposed to exist, and with a city that was falling apart at exactly the right moment for men like this to rise. You have to understand what Detroit was in the 1970s. For decades, this had been the engine of America. The auto plants, the assembly lines, the Motor City. A black man could come up from the South, walk into a Ford plant or a Chrysler plant, and earn a real wage, enough to buy a house, raise a family, build something. Detroit was, for a long time, one of the best places in America to be a working black person. And then it started to come apart. The plants began to close and shrink. The jobs that had pulled people north started to vanish. The unrest of 1967 had torn open something that never fully healed. And through the late 60s and into the 70s, the people with money and the businesses that served them started leaving the city for the suburbs. The tax base went with them. Whole blocks emptied out. The neighborhoods that had been built on factory paychecks were left with the houses, but not the work. And into that vacuum came two things at once. The first was the product. Heroin was flooding into American cities in this era, some of it riding back on the same currents as the Vietnam War, as a generation of young men came home from overseas, carrying habits they had picked up there. Demand was exploding, and in a city where the legitimate jobs were disappearing, the illegitimate economy started looking like the only economy with a future. The second thing was opportunity. for a very specific kind of person. Because when the factories die and the money leaves, the men who rise are the ones willing to do what no one else will. The neighborhoods still needed money to move through them. People still needed a way to eat. And the underground business was suddenly the biggest employer in parts of the city the auto industry had abandoned. That is the Detroit that produced Murder Row. Not a city of opportunity, a city where the old opportunity had died and the only ladder still standing led straight down into the underworld. And the men who would climb it had a relationship that was never supposed to exist. In Detroit, the Italian crime family was old money, old power. They traced back generations to a structure brought over from the old country: bosses, underbosses, soldiers, rules. And at the top of the street operation in the 1960s and 70s were two brothers. Anthony Giacalone, they called him Tony Jack, and his brother Vito, Billy Jack. If those names sound familiar, here is why. These are the two men the federal government believes were behind the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, the most famous unsolved vanishing in American history. That is the level we are talking about. These were not corner bosses. These were the men the FBI believed could make a national figure, the most powerful labor leader in the country, disappear off the face of the earth in broad daylight and never answer for it. Understand what that does to a reputation on the street. When the Giacalones backed you, it was not just money and supply, it was a shadow. Every gangster in Detroit knew that the men standing behind you were the men the government could not touch for the biggest unsolved hit in the country. To move against someone the Giacalones protected was to invite the kind of disappearance that even the FBI could not solve. That protection was worth more than any amount of cash or product. And it is going to matter enormously by the end of this story, because it is the only reason one man in it survived. And the Giacalones, like most of the Italian mafia at that time, did not respect black gangsters. In their world, the black neighborhoods were a market to be milked, not a place to find partners. The drugs flowed in, the money flowed back out, and the men who sold it on the corners were considered disposable. But there was one young man who changed how Tony Jack saw things. His name was Francis Usher. He grew up on the East Side, blocks from where the Giacalones ran their operation, out of a social club. And as a kid, we are talking a boy, 8, 9, 10 years old, he started hanging around, running errands, carrying messages, fetching coffee. There is a newspaper photograph from 1958 that shows a baby-faced Usher carrying the Giacalones' briefcases into a court hearing. A black child carrying the briefcases of the most powerful Italian gangsters in Detroit into a courtroom. That is how far back this goes. And Tony Jack took a liking to him, watched him grow up, watched him get smart and get tough and get ambitious. And somewhere along the way, Tony Jack gave him a nickname that told you exactly how he saw this young man's future. He called him Frank Nitti. Frank Nitti was the name of Al Capone's enforcer in Chicago, the brains behind the muscle, immortalized on television in the show The Untouchables. To pin that name on a young black man from the east side of Detroit was Tony Jack saying out loud, "This one is different. This one is going to be somebody." He was right. But Usher did not build it alone. To understand Murder Row, you have to understand that it stood on two legs. The first was Usher, the East Sider, the one with the deep ties to the Italians, the political mind, the one who could sit in a room with the Giacalones and be trusted. The second was a West Side man named Harold Morton. They called him the Hawk. And Morton brought the one thing Usher's connections could not: supply, real supply. Morton had built relationships with sources in New York and Los Angeles, bi-coastal connections that could keep product flowing into Detroit by the load. Where Usher had the trust of the old powers, Morton had the pipeline. Around 1974, the two of them put it together. An East Side political genius, a West Side supply master, the money, the protection, and the supply lines of the Italian mafia behind them. And they built an organization modeled on the family that backed them. A real hierarchy with bosses and lieutenants and soldiers and rules. Within a few years, Murder Row controlled most of the black underworld in Detroit. The heroin business, the numbers, the gambling, the protection. Usher ran his side from a strip club he owned on the west side called the Black Orchid. The crew kept its headquarters at a place in Midtown called the Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club. Most nights they would gather at Mr. Kelly's Lounge or a bar called the 19th Hole on the east side. They were, by the end of the 1970s, the heads of state of an entire criminal world. And for a stretch there, business was beautiful. Picture what that looked like. Usher holding court at the Black Orchid, the strip club he owned on the west side, a place he ran with an Italian partner, a black man and an Italian man, co-owners, in a city where that partnership was not supposed to exist. The crew rolling between the social club in Midtown and Mr. Kelly's Lounge and the 19th Hole, flush with heroin money, dressed sharp, moving through the city like they owned it, because in a sense they did. The reporters and the gossip columnists tracked their movements. The police tracked their movements. They were celebrities of the underworld, famous and feared in equal measure. And underneath all the glamour was the supply, the protection and the muscle, the three things the Giacalones had given them, and the three things that made them untouchable. Money from the heroin, protection from the Italians, and violence from a roster of men the whole city was afraid of. But the name was not Money Row. It was not Power Row. It was Murder Row. And there was a reason for that. Because the thing that made this organization different, the thing that made even the Italians take a step back, was not the product or the money or the structure. It was the men they kept on call to handle violence. And the most feared of them all was a man named Chester Campbell. If you know this channel, you know that name. We have told his story before, but you cannot tell the story of Murder Row without him, because Chester Campbell was the beating, ice-cold heart of it. The people who knew Campbell described him in terms you usually only hear in movies: a gangland James Bond, the human embodiment of the Grim Reaper, the angel of death. When the police finally searched his world, they found a man who treated killing as a craft, meticulous, prepared, emotionless. He kept himself in peak condition. He studied his targets. He was a professional in a world full of amateurs. He was not a brawler. He was not a hothead who shot people over an insult. That was exactly what made him so frightening. Chester Campbell was patient. He planned. He understood that the most dangerous killer is not the loudest one in the room. It is the quiet one who has already decided days ago exactly how and when it is going to happen, and who feels nothing about it at all. The men around him did not just fear his gun, they feared his calm. And here is the part that tells you everything. Chester Campbell was not just Murder Row's enforcer, he was a Giacalone associate. The Italians themselves used him. They had their own killers, men who had been doing this for generations, and they still kept this man on call. Think about what that means. The oldest, most established crime family in the city looked at their own roster of killers, men whose families had been in this business since before Campbell was born. And then they looked at this one black gangster from Detroit, and they decided they wanted him too. they borrowed him. The Italian mafia, who would not let a black man into their family on principle, made an exception for the angel of death, because some skills are worth breaking the rules for. That is the reputation Murder Row was built on. That was the shadow that fell across the city when their name came up. People on the street did not just respect them. They were, in the words of one account, shaking in their boots. And for a few years, with Campbell as the #1 enforcer, with Morton's supply, with Usher's political mind, and the Giacalone protection, Murder Row was untouchable, the operative phrase being, for a few years. Because every empire built on a few key pillars has the same weakness. You only have to remove the pillars. And the law was about to start removing them one by one. The first pillar to fall was the most important one. In 1975, Chester Campbell was arrested. When they took the angel of death off the board, they took away the thing that made Murder Row truly feared. Usher and Morton tried to fill the hole. They had other men, capable, violent men, but there is only one Grim Reaper. You do not replace a legend with a roster. The single most intimidating force in the organization was suddenly sitting in a cell, and everyone on the street knew it. The crack had started. The second pillar fell 2 years later. In November of 1977, Harold Morton, the Hawk, the supply master, the West Side half of the whole operation, got caught in a heroin smuggling case in New York. This was the artery of the entire organization. Morton's bi-coastal connections, New York on one end, Los Angeles on the other, were what kept the product flowing into Detroit by the load. He moved weight using couriers, including women who carried for him between the coasts. And it was one of those couriers that brought him down. Because this is where you see the kind of organization Murder Row really was. The reason Morton's case turned fatal for him was tied to a potential witness, one of those couriers, a woman who knew the routes, the names, the methods, a woman who could put him away. She was killed in Los Angeles after she began cooperating with the authorities. That is the world we are in. A world where a witness who opens her mouth does not live to reach the stand. But killing her did not save Morton. The case against him held, and he went to prison anyway. The Hawk was off the board. And now, both of the men who had built this thing from nothing, the enforcer who made it feared, and the supplier who made it rich, were gone within 2 years of each other, which left Frank Nitty Usher running an empire that was missing its foundation. And it left a vacuum at the #2 position, the underboss role, the right hand. In any organization like this, a vacuum at the top is the most dangerous thing that can happen, because somebody is always watching. Somebody is always measuring the distance between where they stand and where the power sits. And the man watching, in this case, was one of the most dangerous men in the entire crew. His name was Adolph Powell. The streets called him Doc Holliday. Doc Holliday had come up as a driver and a bodyguard for Harold Morton. He was muscle, and he had watched the bosses operate from up close for years. And when Morton went to prison, Doc Holliday did not mourn. He saw an opening, where Usher was stoic, quiet, calculating, a man who kept his cards close. Doc Holliday was the opposite, flamboyant, loud, boastful. He liked the attention, he liked the fear, he liked people knowing exactly who he was. And he had decided that he was not going to spend the rest of his life as somebody's lieutenant. He wanted to run Murder Row. And the only thing standing between Doc Holliday and the top was Frank Nitty Usher. So through the late 1970s, the temperature inside the organization started to climb. 2 power centers in one crew, the quiet boss and the loud lieutenant. Loyalties splitting, Soldiers quietly choosing sides, the kind of slow, simmering tension that anyone who has studied these organizations will tell you only ends one way. And then, in early 1979, it boiled over, and it started the way these things so often do, over something that had nothing to do with business at all. Two Murder Row men got into a conflict over a woman. A soldier named Lefty Partee and another man were both pursuing the same woman's affections. The dispute escalated. Usher, trying to keep the peace, told Partee to back off. But Partee did not take it to Usher. He took it to Doc Holliday. And Doc Holliday saw an opportunity to flex his growing power. He summoned the other man, a Usher loyalist, to a meeting. And when that man got mouthy with him, Doc gave the word, and Lefty Partee shot him dead right there inside the social club in January of 1979. It was a message. Doc Holliday could now order the death of one of the boss's own men inside the boss's own headquarters, and the boss could do nothing about it. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in Murder Row could feel which way the wind was blowing. Usher knew what was coming. He had spent his whole life around men who solved problems permanently. He could read the board, and the board said that Doc Holliday was no longer content to be number two. But nothing in Usher's entire life around violence could have prepared him for what Doc Holliday actually had planned. Because Doc Holliday was not just going to take the throne, he was going to make Usher watch. It was the late afternoon of July the 18th, 1979. Doc Holliday made some phone calls. He called Usher to a meeting at the Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club, the crew's own headquarters, and he called two of Usher's most trusted lieutenants, a man named William McJoy, who the streets called Little Dirty, and a man named William Jackson, who they called Straw Hat. Along with them came a woman named Joanne Clark, the girlfriend of another one of Usher's top men. They came to the club thinking it was business. Doc Holliday had arranged for two men to be there waiting, the same Lefty Partee from the earlier killing, and another Murder Row soldier called Jimmy Red Freeman. According to the case files, these were the triggermen. When everyone was inside, the meeting turned into something else. McJoy, Jackson, and Joanne Clark. The two lieutenants and the woman were forced to the floor, and they were executed one after another on the floor of the social club. And Frank Nitty Usher, the boss, the man whose lieutenants these were, was made to stand there and watch it happen, powerless, surrounded, forced to witness the destruction of his own people in his own house. I am not going to walk you through everything that was done to those three people after they were killed. It is among the most disturbing things in the entire history of this city's underworld, and out of respect for the dead, the details are not what matters here. What matters is this. Doc Holliday did not just kill them. He made a celebration of it. The case files describe him opening a bottle of champagne, lighting a cigar, treating the most horrifying night in Detroit's criminal history as a party, his coronation. And then he forced Usher himself to take part in the disposal as a final humiliation, a way of binding the boss to the crime and breaking him at the same time. When Welton, one of Doc's own men, asked why they were not killing Usher too, Doc Holliday reportedly said, "We'll take care of him tomorrow." But investigators came to believe Doc never actually intended to kill Usher at all. And the reason is the most telling detail in this entire story. He was afraid, not of Usher, of the men behind Usher. Doc Holliday knew that Frank Nitty Usher was the Giacalone's man. The Italians had raised him, financed him, protected him for decades. To kill Usher was to declare war on the most powerful crime family in Michigan, the men who made people disappear and never answered for it. And on top of that, Usher was the access point to the heroin supply that kept the whole operation rich. So the man who had just orchestrated one of the most savage massacres in the city's history, the man celebrating with champagne over 3 bodies, did not dare touch the one person he most needed gone. The fear the Italians had built into this crew now cut both ways. Even Murder Row's most ruthless killer was terrified of what stood behind the boss, and that fear is the only reason Frank "Nitty" Usher walked out of that club alive. Now, you would think a crime that horrifying, with that many people involved, would be impossible to keep quiet. You would be right. The whole thing came apart almost immediately, and it came apart because of the disposal. The men Doc Holliday tasked with getting rid of the remains botched it. The bodies were loaded into a van, but the job was rushed and chaotic, and the van ended up abandoned on the east side of Detroit. And then a citizen walking by noticed something, blood, dripping from the van. They called the police, and when the police opened that van, the most carefully hidden secret in Detroit's underworld spilled out into the open. 3 people. The headlines that followed dominated the city through the summer of 1979. Now the pressure was on, and the investigators did the one thing that breaks an organization built on fear. They found the people who were more afraid of the police than they were of Murder Row, and they got them to talk. A doorman at the social club, an older man named Forrest Alexander, who had seen what happened, and a woman named Cynthia Skeens. Both of them flipped. Both became witnesses for the government. And in a world where witnesses do not survive, that is exactly what they tried to do next. One of Doc Holliday's own men, Mickey Welton, who had helped with the disposal and whose girlfriend had also started cooperating, was killed that October. The machine did what the machine always did. It tried to murder its way back to silence. But this time there were too many bodies, too many headlines, too many people talking. Frank "Nitty" Usher ran. He bolted for Indianapolis the day after the massacre. But there was no running from this one. The prosecutors built their case, and they brought an indictment for the triple murder against 5 men. Usher, Doc Holliday, Lefty Partee, Jimmy "Red" Freeman, and another man named Benny Fountain. What followed was not a trial. It was a decade. Think about how rare that is. Most of these cases are over in a matter of weeks. A jury hears it, they decide it is done. This one consumed 10 years of courtrooms because almost nothing about it was clean. The witnesses were terrified. The defendants had money and lawyers. And the central figure, Usher, was a man the evidence said had been a victim of the very crime he was charged with. The first trial ended with a hung jury. The 12 people in that box could not agree on what they had heard. Mistrial. Start again. So they tried it a second time. And at the second trial, the verdicts came back split, and they came back almost backwards from what you would expect. Doc Holliday, the man who, according to every account in those case files, orchestrated the entire massacre, who celebrated over the bodies, who forced the boss to watch, Doc Holliday was acquitted. So were Jimmy "Red" Freeman and Benny Fountain. The cases against them did not hold up. But Frank "Nitty" Usher was convicted, and so was Lefty Partee. Usher, the man who had been forced to the wall, who by the case file's own account was an intended victim that night, not a planner of it, was found guilty of the murders of his own people and sentenced to life in prison. Sit with how upside down that is. The man who threw the party over the corpses walked out of the courtroom free. The man who was forced to watch his own lieutenants die went to prison for it. But remember who Frank "Nitty" Usher was. Remember whose briefcases he had carried as a boy. The Giacalones did not abandon him. They funded his defense, a deep, well-resourced legal war chest, the kind of money most defendants in Detroit could only dream of. While other men in that case made do with whatever lawyer they could afford, Usher had the financial weight of the most powerful crime family in Michigan behind him, and his lawyers went to work on that conviction with the patience of people who were not going to run out of money. They got it overturned on appeal. And then at a third trial in 1989, 10 years after that night at the social club, Frank "Nitty" Usher finally convinced a jury of what the case files had said all along, that he was a victim of the massacre, not a participant, that he had been forced to the wall like everyone else and survived only because Doc Holliday was too afraid of the men behind him to finish the job. He beat the case. A decade after the most notorious mass killing in the city's history, the last man standing from that night walked out of Awart a free man. But the streets had already settled their own accounts, years before the courts finished theirs. Because Doc Holliday, the man who had won in the courtroom, who had been acquitted, who had taken his shot at the throne and seemingly gotten away with all of it, the streets did not let him keep it. In 1983, 6 years before Usher's final acquittal, Doc Holliday was sitting at the bar of a popular East Side night spot called La Players Lounge. He was doing exactly what a man at the top of the world does, having a drink, tipping the bartender with a $100 bill, and as he lifted that glass of whiskey, someone walked up and shot him in the head. An audacious public gangland execution in a crowded bar. The same kind of cold professional violence that Doc Holliday had built his whole reputation on, delivered right back to him, mid-drink, mid-tip, mid-celebration. He never saw the throne he had killed so many people to reach. The man who made Frank "Nitty" Usher watch his own people die got his own ending at a bar with a $100 bill still in his hand, and that left Usher, the boy who carried the briefcases, the young man Tony Jack looked at and saw a future Frank "Nitty", the East Side genius who built Detroit's black mob with the blessing of the Italian mafia, and then survived the night it all came apart, and then beat the murder case 3 trials deep on Giacalone money. He outlived all of them. He stayed close to the Italians for the rest of his life. When Tony Jack Giacalone died in 2001, and when Billy Jack died in 2012, Usher was there. At one Giacalone associate's funeral, he served as a pallbearer, standing alongside the new generation of the family he had served since he was a child, carrying briefcases into court. The relationship that was never supposed to exist, the black kid and the Italian bosses, lasted more than half a century, all the way to the grave. In 2015, in his 70s, Usher was arrested one more time, accused of a hand-to-hand heroin sale. The charges were dropped before it ever went to trial. The old man beat one last case. And in 2020, Francis "Big Frank" Nitty Usher died of a stroke. 78 years old, in his own bed, a free man. So what do you take from a story like this? You take this. The Italian mafia broke their oldest rule and built themselves a weapon. They funded it, armed it, supplied it, and turned it loose on the city, a crew so cold that even the men who created it kept their distance. And for a few years, it worked exactly the way they wanted. But a weapon like that does not stay pointed where you aim it. Murder Row did not fall to the police, or to a rival, or to the Italians who built it. It fell to itself. It turned inward and devoured its own, its lieutenants on the floor of their own clubhouse, its boss in a cell for a crime he did not commit, its most dangerous man shot dead over a glass of whiskey. The Giacalones wanted men who would do the things their own people would not. They got exactly what they asked for. And then they got to watch what those men were willing to do to each other